All right. So we are now live streaming on Facebook. So for everybody here on Zoom, my name is Sarah Parks. I am with the St. Joseph Museums, which includes the Glore Psychiatric Museum. We are happy to have you this evening as we do our psychology social hour over poems from the Asylum. And we're happy to have Janelle Molony and Jodi here with us, and all of you as participants as well. A little Zoom housekeeping. For those of you joining us here, we will ask you to have your video off for now, just so our presentation is more the slideshow at this time, and then to have us muted until the question section at the end. At that time, feel free to log back on your video and come unmute if you wish. Otherwise, you can add questions in the chat. Facebook Live, also, I'll be checking those comments. So feel free to put those either place. And with I think that's all the housekeeping I have. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Janelle.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Janelle Molony. I am an award-winning author and historian. And recently, in the pandemic times, I have put together poems from the Asylum based on my great-grandmother, who is on the screen now, Martha Nash. She has been hailed as the woman who never ate, never drank, never slept for 7 years. And there are eyewitnesses that agree to that. And they say, even within a short period of time of her making those claims, absolutely, they are true. So I'm happy to be presenting to you the story of my great-grandmother, her experience in a 1920s American insane asylum, talk a little bit about the book, and uncover some of the secrets that are part of her story. So before I do that, I wanted to recognize my mother, Jodi Nash, as a very important research assistant in this process. She did know Martha, and unfortunately, I never had the chance to meet her. So I wanted to say thank you for the contributions to the book and the research overall. All right. So as a reminder, if you have questions that come up in this presentation, put them in the chat, whether you're on Zoom or on Facebook, so that way at the end we can have a really nice, robust conversation. So I am a family historian and genealogist for several families in my ancestry. I'm also a developmental editor and a freelance journalist. And I feel it's important to mention that I do work in news media and news journalism because of the relationship to how Martha was not only written about, but perceived in the media, and also the way that we receive media today and are able to chew it apart. We have now fake news and things like that. We have accountability for our news journalists, and these things are all really nice. She didn't have that back then, so we'll be able to see how her story got blown way out of proportion. This book would not be possible without the generous support of my grandfather, Ralph, who provided these material items, including Martha's journal from the St. Peter State Hospital in Minnesota. So he is no longer with us, but I thank him anyways. So I wanted to tell you first off, how did I meet my great-grandmother, since I never got to meet her in person? Here she is, Martha Nash. On the left, this is a picture of her in her 30s. This is pre-committal. She's kind of a cute catch, in my opinion. She's typically in the scrapbooks a very fashionable woman. She's got fancy hats, every hat that is new in the season. She wears beautiful dresses that she hand makes. She's a fantastic seamstress in her own right. And in this picture here on the left, this is her in St. Paul, and she weighs about 140 pounds at the age of 34. Now, just for context, I am 35 and I weigh about the same. I am not overweight, but I'm not skinny by any means. So I wanted to put that into context, because here on the right, we have Martha post-release. She spent almost 7 years in confinement in the asylum, and she came out weighing 103 pounds. And I don't know about the other watchers out there, but I think I weighed 103 when I was 11 years old. So this is a dramatic reduction in weight. But as you can see, she is kind of totally fine. She is typically smiling in her slight smile way. So you'll see that she's not looking sickly, other than just being extremely thin. So besides seeing some pictures of her in scrapbooks, when I started to look up in the family tree all about my ancestors, I started to Google who these people are. And this is some of the things that I found on newspaper headlines, front pages, university headlines, and Time magazine. So here's one that I found from the Berkshire Evening Eagle in 1934 upon her release. It says, "Throw away your diet list, girls. Mrs. Martha Nash insists she has gone without food and feels fine at that." And there we have her pictured in her front yard in St. Paul, Minnesota, looking pretty pleasantly fine. Also in 1934, we have, despite scoffing by doctors, Mrs. Martha Nash declares that she has neither slept nor eaten food for 7 years and affirmed her willingness to test her powers. Now, I honestly don't think she said I have superpowers whatsoever. So here we can see that one story leads to another, and they're starting to get a little more crazy, which is just too bad. In the Gazette, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce that one, it says she is claiming she has not slept or partaken of any food or water for 7 years. Mrs. Martha Nash offered to prove her feat to anyone or undergo any test. And she dared her readers to put her under lock and key for 6 months, if need be, to prove she never consumed a single bite or drank a drop. Here we can see that the media has taken the liberty of doing an early version of Photoshop on her, where she suddenly has permanent marker, darkened eyebrows, and a false sense of bottom teeth, false set. So we're getting a little more out of control. The Ohio University paper called her a phenomenon in nature. She swore she had eaten no food, drank no liquids, and not slept a wink within the last 7 years, with witnesses who bear her out. And this all culminates in a very exciting Time Weekly News magazine feature, where in 23 words, my great-grandmother becomes the punchline of a joke. In St. Paul, it reads, "Mrs. Martha Nash swore that for 7 years she had not eaten a mouthful, drunk a drop, slept a wink." Now, these things we all probably agree are impossible. We know that if you stop drinking, you die. We know if you stop eating, you die. We know if you stop sleeping now, you die. So how is this even possible? We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I wanted to show you my first impression before I got to these more credible resources, if we could even say that. The first thing I saw when I wanted to learn who my great-grandmother was from the Museum of Hoaxes, which potentially is a hoax in itself. The Museum of Hoaxes opened in 1997. It's similar to Ripley's Believe It or Not. It explores deception, mischief, misinformation throughout history, and a variety of humbugs and hoodwinks from its webpage description. And they went so far as to say they can't find any death records for Martha. Maybe she's still alive. After all, if she didn't need to eat or drink, it's possible she didn't need to die either. On that note, yes, she has a death certificate. Yes, she did die. We do know that as a family. We have her obit. And that was sad as well. But this is not a great way to get to know one's family member, as the total laughingstock not only of her community, but of the world. This story went so far as to cross the borders from America into Canada, and it was printed on the front page and other pages over 90 times in a span of 3 months. So way back when, she went viral. And unfortunately, there's nothing we could do to stop it. At that time, there are no similar regulations to journalism that would say, hey, you have to fact check before you print that. They're not accountable for what they put out, as blasphemous or impossible as it may read. So this made us quite uncomfortable. As we were reading that, we were thinking, oh my goodness, did Grandma really like just starve for 7 years? No, she didn't. But there's an explanation for everything, right? So as we begin to talk about her, one fun thing to point out is that she has gone viral again. It is with just bowls me over that people are still so fascinated by her experience that she has now been featured in genealogical journals, in Minnesota history journals, in mental health magazines that are international. She's been featured in short story anthologies, national and international radio and podcasting. She's been on Minnesota Live TV and is now a person of interest for PBS. So we're very excited for her. However, as we now step into this new sort of post-mortem fame, we're really hoping as a family to be able to tell the story correctly and adjust some of those facts that the journalists of the past decided to share. So who was the real Martha? What is the truth? And why do we even bother telling it? So as a quick reminder, if you have questions, go ahead and type them up for us now before you forget, and then we'll come around to them. Martha Nasch grew up in Belle Plaine Borough of East Minnesota. It's a teeny tiny ethnic community, and she is a first-generation German, and English probably was not her first language at home, but she grew up in times of World War I, and also because of the World War I oppression that was put upon German families, she would have faced a pressure to be less German and really embrace her Americanism. Now, she did this all while raising a good old American boy, making sure that he never had to experience the same oppressions. So he never learned German. He was not exposed to many of the family culture, tradition, etc. So she was dealing with trying to balance racial oppression in her own life during a time of major economic depression. So we do have reason to believe she might have experienced depression or just been in a general place of hard times, like many of us have experienced recently. She married Louis, who is seen on the left. He is a dandy. He is the definition of a dandy pre-marriage. After they got married, he struggled significantly to keep an income as a painter. He would often take contract positions that would remove him from the home for several months at a time. They were often on welfare, and it was a source of embarrassment for Martha. Seen in the picture in her garden, her luscious Victory garden, is her younger sister Emma, who she dedicated her poems to in the future when she goes to the asylum. And also behind the picture of her with her little medallion there are pictures of their cousins that live across the street who were well off. They had secure jobs and a large home. So she lived across the street from people who were doing fine, and she was not doing fine. And it was constantly perhaps rubbed in her face. So we have to consider those kind of pressures that were on her as well. So after 8 years of marriage, Martha and Louis only had one child. This child came with difficulty, and it's important to remember that point because in her poetry, she yearns for children. She yearns for children that weren't born. So we do suspect that there might have possibly been other children or close to have been other children, although we don't have hard evidence of that. The family suffered from the anti-German discrimination. They were frequently on welfare support, as I mentioned. But one day, we think, while Louis, her husband, was out on a 5-month work contract in Illinois, Martha received in the mail, or intercepted in the mail, or found a perfumed letter that was addressed to her husband from a lady friend, in quotes, lady friend, wink, wink. She did confront him about this and the potential for adultery, and he refused to acknowledge that he was an adulterer. Now, back at this time, that would have been one of the requirements for her to obtain a divorce. She couldn't get a divorce without that admission, so she did the next best thing. She moved back in with her mom and dad for a while. He followed her around like a puppy dog, brought her back, but he still is who he is. So we also have marital strife to add to the equation. In 1927, having no more children, remembering this, at the age of 37, while Lewis was out of town again, Martha went to a surgeon. Now, I want to preface that with, we don't know what kind of surgeon, we don't know where she had the surgery, but we do wonder how she was able to obtain a surgery without her husband being around. So there are many suspicions about that. So she went to a surgeon. She had an operation, as her husband has called it, misspelled it. And this operation left her too physically weak to walk for over 3 months. Again, we don't know exactly what it is, but it's possible it had to do with her abdomen, or it could have been of a gynecological nature. However, we have been unable to get any proof of that. After this operation, Martha said to her doctor within the same 24 hours that she was having trouble tasting food. She was having weird sensations with her tongue and a loss of appetite. And these were very strange symptoms to be linked to a procedure that is gynecological, hypothetically, allegedly, maybe. So naturally, the doctor might have been confused and said, I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't operate up here. So he said that she had a case of nerves. However, we've been able to dig into 100 years of medical case studies for what kinds of things happen in surgery that would lead to these symptoms that she is quoted saying in those very salacious news media articles. So fortunately, they captured enough of her quotations that we could use them for empirical research. So in surgery, I'm just going to give it away here. We're not keeping secrets from the book, although the book has more information than what you're hearing today. In surgery, we have this new invention of a rubber endotracheal tube and a laryngoscope. Ivan McGill invented this new design as seen on the left in about 1928. There were earlier designs of it in 1927. In this time, there are no dedicated anesthesiologists available for surgeries, which is quite unfortunate. The doctors would insert the tubes. They might have a pump, either by hand or by foot, to operate the release of gas, laughing gas or ether or chloroform, and try to do all of their other surgical requirements as well at the same time. It was just too much. So a lot of things did go wrong. There were minor improvements to anesthesiology in the 1940s with the introduction of dedicated anesthesiologists, but unfortunately Martha was not privy to that. So we're taking a look at the endotracheal tube and we're seeing how it goes down and presses on the back teeth. Okay, so you can see that in the picture, and I'm going to do a close-up here. When the endotracheal tube presses on the back teeth for an extended period of time, or perhaps if she had clenched her teeth or been positioned in an awkward way, it's possible that that tube applied too much pressure or too long, applied pressure for too long on her sublingual nerve. As you can see, it's running in blue. The sublingual nerve runs up to your pons, right about by your temple. And this controls one half, there's one on each side, one half of your tongue. It controls the nerve sensation. It controls the interpretation of flavor. It controls even motor control. So being able to roll the food around in your mouth, to be able to swallow it properly, to be able to sense if that food is hot or cold. And honestly, if I couldn't taste food and everything tasted like cardboard or nothing, the loss of appetite seems to make sense with this type of damage. We have another close-up here showing where that lingual nerve runs right under the back teeth and that little gummy gap that's at the back of the jaw. Now, any pressure to the tongue or to those soft palate items, or even directly on the teeth, could have created these symptoms. The symptoms put together are called dysgeusia. And dysgeusia is that loss of sensation or that sensation disorder in the tongue. Sometimes it goes away, sometimes it doesn't. In her case, we don't know. Unfortunately, by telling the doctor after a surgery that had nothing to do with her mouth that she could not eat, she could not drink like other people, she could not taste like other people, and she was struggling. After 6 months of telling her doctor, it's not getting better, it's not going away, he did not know what to do with her. There was no known dysgeusia at that time. There was, with the new intubation procedures, not enough research to say this was a probable cause. So his hands were tied. There was no other option. He suggested to her husband that she needed to be admitted for psychiatric care, and he readily agreed. Now, that takes a little financial burden off of him and allows him to go on living his sweet life with his sweet lady friend with no consequences. She was admitted in 1928 on a freezing cold January morning, discharged 6.5 years later on parole. She was sentenced to 7 years, though. So at this time, I wanted to bring Sarah back on from Glore Psychiatric Museum and just out of curiosity, play with you a little bit here. Why do psychiatric patients get quote unquote sentenced? Why is there not, okay, we treat you until you're better and then bye? Why is there a full on, this is going to take you that much time?
It kind of depended on the individual, but usually at that time, I'm coming from a place of Missouri State Hospitals, so I just wanted to reiterate that for those of you that may have not joined us at the beginning. I am the education manager at the Glore Psychiatric Museum, which covers the history of the 5 state Missouri hospitals. So as far as in Missouri, which is kind of the case in most of the United States because they were all basically built on the same foundation through Thomas Kirkbride and Dorothea Dix. So that at that time, so about 1874, we're still kind of learning what germs are as a society. As Janelle said, we're still like medically, adapting and building on that. We didn't have patient rights at that point. Didn't have patient rights until 1960. So patient rights were not a thing. You could get admitted by your family members. You didn't have really a say in that matter. Unfortunately, less so as a woman at that time, because you had to be, once you were sentenced or committed to one of the state hospitals, you did have to be released by your husband or a male family member. So it kind of was up to those medical professionals whether they thought you were fit to be released or not.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I noted on Martha's admission ticket or record that we have here, one of the few that we have, is that she was released from payment by board. And this is something we have since learned, that in the situation where someone is unable to pay the medical bill, we've learned since that it could be as much as $10 a month to support that person being in the asylum. So she was released for payment, likely because of the family's financial situation, and perhaps in a way that would have been a little bit of a motivator or an encouragement to say, hey, just let her stay as long as she needs to stay on her husband's behalf. She's not a burden to him whatsoever. So, fun little thing to point out. So, as Sarah mentioned, she's at the Glore Psychiatric Museum, and today we're talking about the St. Peter Asylum, or the State Insane Asylum in St. Peter, which is about 2 hours southwest of St. Paul, Minnesota. St. Peter's boasted 3 floors and 3 wards for 3 different types of patients. They had a detention ward, which was pretty close to basic hospital care. They had the asylum for the insane, and they had an asylum just for the criminally ill. Later, they would have and open up a tuberculosis ward, and it really was convalescent in nature, just to keep them away from others and try to keep that disease from spreading. The hospital opened in 1866, and like many of those built after the Civil War, they constantly struggled from overcrowding and underfunding, and there was a lack of knowledge regarding true psychiatric disorder origins until about the 1930s, when we started to have folks like Carl Jung starting to speak up a little bit more, women starting to advocate for themselves. After the I believe it's 1948 expose by Time magazine, people started to really see that we needed to take a second look at how we treat those who have mental illness. And mental health care for women during Martha's stay included hysteria at this time, which was a very generous, vague term that could be used to cover a lot of different other issues. And some of the cures for hysteria included hysterectomies and later lobotomies. Fortunately, she was released. I was going to say she got out. Fortunately, she was released before the lobotomy started to be practiced or tested on patients. While Martha was, let's say, committed at the St. Peter Hospital, there were Utica crits that were used as restraints, and these are used as punishment for escapees at that time. They are used to quiet the disturbed or ultimately just keep someone restrained if they're being physically violent. Perhaps in Martha's case, if she had escaped, and she did twice, she would have spent some time in here, so that way she could be left to think about her choices or decisions that she'd made. They also implemented hydrotherapy and hydroelectric therapy, or ECT, as well, and that's coming up. Hydrotherapy could involve a wet blanket wrapped around someone, helping them to sweat out or change their bodily temperatures. Hydroelectric therapy could involve baths for a very long time with electricity added to them. Now, those are actually, they sound like torture, but they are pretty common, even way back into Civil War times and pre-Civil War times, where folks would frequently use hydrotherapy to cure things such as heat stroke or other illnesses. And even hydroelectric therapy has been found to be used to treat hysteria back into the 1860s. And it was one of those folksy, hoaxy things you would see in the newspaper, similar to snake oil advertisements, but electrical baths would help with menstrual cramps or other things of that nature. ECT electroshock therapy was rather new during Martha's stay. She never mentioned it, but there are other accounts from the hospital of patients who were there at the same time that would mention everyone would line up. It was used regularly, and it's still in sort of a testing, figuring it out phase, not sure how much to dose someone, how often to dose someone, but people would line up because it was their scheduled day to go get ECT. Some patients were like, all right, let's get it done, and others were terrified. And they often, if they were the next person in line, they would be one to help hold the patient down. So they knew what was happening when it would be done to them. So for some people, that could be additionally terrifying. For some, maybe it helped take a little of the fear out. But it did have some benefits, in addition to, in my opinion, being absolutely horrific. But we still do use electrical shock in many modern scientific treatments. So we've come a long way, but we've been able to dial it in a little bit, as Sarah can tell you. So Sarah, I wanted to pick your brain a little bit more on sometimes the use being therapeutic the best we could at the time versus sometimes the use of these things being more of a punishment towards patients who were misbehaving.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, we kind of go from 1874 when The State Lunatic Asylum #2 here in Missouri was founded all the way up through 1960s, and then more present. The 1960s was really what started to dial back these state institutions. But really those early years were, everybody was just a medical doctor. There was no specializations. There was really trial and error and guessing. Every mental health disorder is individual. And unfortunately, there's a whole lot of side effects that we can see and a lot that we can't. So a lot of it was that trial error process. So like I said, 1874, we were still really learning what germs were. We still thought like 4 humors controlled the body. So a lot of those early treatments do look pretty torturous. And we have a room specifically here that were built by patients in the 60s to show that kind of transition between those early history treatments and what the state hospital was doing at that time, because they had an open house, and that's really what kicked our museum off. But those early treatments involve things like the Utica cribs, mostly just restraining, because they didn't know what was wrong. They didn't know what to do. So it was easier just to restrain you or keep you under control, especially if you were gonna harm yourself or other people. So that's really big in the early history. Hydrotherapy, at first, I always like to throw this tidbit out there. At first it was cold water. So things like to shock you back into your system, or to shock you back into normalcy because something was wrong, off balance. They wanted to basically the same train of thought that we scare people when they have hiccups. The scaring them doesn't cure them. The breathing erratically calms your diaphragm down, but it's kind of, A to B equals a cure. So let's keep doing that. So that kind of thing very early on. Then it became more warm baths, very soothing, rain sounds. There has been a link between moving water with its negative ions and our mostly positive ion life, that things like the beach or rivers and any moving water really helps us calm down because of that. So they're on to some really good things, just not quite there yet. So a lot of things they thought, especially Dorothea Dix and Thomas Kirkbride, were really passionate about having patients have their own room with their own window, so they got lots of fresh air and sunlight, which obviously all good things, but they're not long-term treatments because they don't really attack what's wrong in the body. It's more a band-aid treatment for things to make you feel good for a while. So one of my favorite stories here to tell people is, it just seems very 2020 vision looking back, but about the 1930s, a lot of patients here were treated for syphilis because there wasn't a real big cure for that, but it was still causing mental health issues if left untreated for a long time. It's fairly easy to treat now, wasn't back then. So their treatment was actually giving patients a really high fever for a few days to kill off the syphilis virus. They accomplished that one of 2 ways. The first really kind of unsafe method was using basically a hot box, or like a tanning bed, but without the actual like UV rays. So basically you sit in it, they increase your core temperature to about 104 for a little while, kills all the virus, you're good to go.
Because the other one they started using, was it yellow fever or something like that?
Malaria. They actually started using malaria. Yeah. So with the hot boxes, obviously like burns and stuff, and it's very uncomfortable. So the safer treatment was to give the patients a mild form of malaria to get a fever, and then you cure both. So very interesting history with that. And you can see looking back where those building blocks started, but it did take a long time to get there.
Means to an end. We don't know, again, that Martha did personally receive those treatments that we see, that we just looked at, but we do have mentions in her writing about being confined, the use of camisoles, and we also see cuffs and chains. She mentions chains a lot. I don't imagine she enjoyed being in chains, but as you can see from some of these photos, with the lack of supervisory care, sometimes that was all they could do to just be able to watch all the patients without them getting in fights or becoming physically ill or violent with each other or to themselves. Just similar to how teachers, when I was little, be like, you go to this corner, you go to that corner, you're all in timeout, stay in your own corners. So it did seem like that. And I know Sarah's got a little camisole to show us, but I want her to bring that out as soon as we talk about that in her poetry. So Martha was here for 6.5 years. I did see the question about why she was institutionalized. Again, that was because she was telling the doctor that she could not taste or eat or even swallow or sense food, and she had lost her appetite. And at the time, they had no clue what she was talking about. She must be crazy. On the 1930 census, we do see her listed as a patient. Some were listed as inmates. I assume those were in the criminally ill ward. And it says she has no occupation. Some of them are assigned chores like laundry or cooking or in the garden and such. Chores were used as an occupational therapy of sorts to get them out and get them busy and feeling like they've got a little bit of a normal life again. And I'm a little disappointed that great grandma decided to be like, what, if I'm going to be stuck in here, I might as well kick my feet up and make the best of it. Maybe. She resided here, as I said, for a total of 6.5 years as patient 20864. And her son remembered visiting her twice a month, taking 4-hour round trip bus trips to see her. She would be just out of reach of her hometown in Belle Plaine, her siblings being in Henderson. So this is kind of quite embarrassing to not be so far out of town, so far out of reach. She's actually really close to her family still, and they could have visited quite frequently. But Ralph could only see his mother a few times, as his father could afford to make that trip. While committed, she kept a journal of poetry and dedicated it to her little sister Emma, who we saw at the beginning. This book of poetry started out as reflections on friends and family that were missed at home. It started out talking about the flower garden in her front yard, and suddenly, a little bit more than a third through, it starts to talk about things she's eyewitnessing in the asylum. And there are theories to this. If she was writing letters back home, it would be completely routine for a social worker, a caseworker, a nurse to even scan her writing and make sure that nothing that would create a negative impression on the hospital would be released. And so in a way, writing poetry, she could tuck in and hide some very serious and potentially scary truths about what was going on around her and be able to get away with it, because if someone were to pick up her book of poetry, the first 2 stanzas, or these chunks of 4, the first 2 stanzas were pretty placid and just missing home. But once you get to stanza 5, she's talking about the chains and the people who are being violently assaulted in the asylum. And fortunately, we don't have any records of her being part of that, but we just don't know. So perhaps one of the ways to get these eyewitness accounts out was to hand deliver this book of poetry that would have allowed her to get these leaks out. In the past, statements about patient mistreatment and other perhaps nurses who had gone a little too far with the way that they took their responsibilities, these stories have been squelched by the hospital. You know, it's bad press, it's bad PR. It doesn't make people want to invest money or increase taxes and support that institution if the institution is harming people. So there was and has been a concerted effort to make sure that these types of things are not out there. However, Sneaky Martha found a way to get them out. So some of her poetry that we have, and this comes from a notebook passed down through her son Ralph. Some of her poetry is very cute. It is mostly about missing her children or her child. although she does mention other children that don't exist that we know of. She talks frequently about missing being home. She loves her little home and her beautiful garden. There's so many mentions of flowers. So some of them are on the screen. And when I stop the presentation, I'll show you the actual notebook. Unfortunately, we also get to see some of the more harrowing eyewitness accounts that she wrote on her own behalf and for other patients. And I don't exactly want to read these out loud, but they are available for you to read on the presentation. Some of them can be triggering, but she does mention patients being in perfect health and not needing to be in any kind of psychiatric care, and yet they just can't leave because they're a woman and no one is able to sign them out. In one case, there is a mother she writes about, and that her children are now orphans because the husband is now dead. But the mother cannot release herself, and the husband would have had to release her. So now there's orphans for no good reason. So Martha advocates for this patient and writes a poem dedicated to her to say that's not okay. That's not how it should be. One of my favorite of the darker poems is in the Asylum, and it's on the bottom. And in that she says, in this place, like a factory, they come in day by day. Some of them restored to health. Some are much too violent. They rave and rant around. To keep them under control, in camisole are bound. So I want to take us back to Martha was not mentally ill. She may have felt a little bit crazy being in this situation and being in a position where no one believed her, no one understood the nerve damage that she was experiencing. The other possibility is that being surrounded by people who may have been violent, may have been catatonic or in other serious conditions, could have disturbed her almost through an osmosis way. But I wanted to ask Sarah if she would show us what this camisole is, because we're all very familiar with a straitjacket, and a camisole is not quite that.
Right. So the camisole actually was a precursor. 1800s fashion, as we all know, is quite elaborate. So this ended up being fastened in the back, like a straitjacket is today, but not with buckles. It is corseted.
There's no way someone could untie themselves, huh?
Right. Well, they improved on that because in this there is still. So you could have the corset in the back. The grommets did tie there. They also tied through the sleeve. So that's what the sleeve detail looks like. They are very sturdy materials. So fabric wise, they were made out of the same fabric that mattresses would be constructed out of. They then were sewn, I'm not sure if you guys can see this, but they were sewn in a way, multiple directions, so they wouldn't rip. So you couldn't rip out of one. They did, however, not have a bottom strap that modern straitjackets do to shrug them over your shoulders. So that is one addition to a more modern straitjacket than a camisole. But we do have, these were made at the state hospital. They still have the strap in the front to put your arms through and also help your attendant guide you with that. But they were most often made at the state hospitals in their sewing rooms or quilting rooms. So you may have been a patient and made your own straitjacket at one point in your time.
I also learned a little bit about the use of the camisole versus the straitjacket, especially in a woman's ward, because it's more practical for sanitary reasons. So that would have been more common. Good news is Martha not escaped, but she did escape 2 times. She was returned within 24 hours, perhaps found, or perhaps she walked back in after curfew. We don't know. But she made her way out in 1934 and promptly, upon her son's 18th birthday, divorced her husband who had her committed And we see her on the left. She is recently out of the asylum, about 2 years out. She's still quite tall, quite thin. And she didn't really flesh out until she met her new husband, Bill, who's also from that small town where she grew up. And we are very happy to know that when she was with Bill, she did obviously begin eating better and feeling better. Her smile is miles wide. And so we do see evidence that being in a healthy relationship definitely improved her mental health. There was one more surprise when we researched Martha, and that had to do with a later reference to her by George Clement, or he's also known as Hilton Hotima, and he wrote pseudo-medical textbooks about a breatharian lifestyle where one reduces their caloric intake in favor of finding strength, power, energy from a spiritual resource. Rather than trying to eat all of our energy, we can rely on a spiritual resource to supplant some of that or replace some of that. And he has referenced her multiple times in his material as being one of the early breatharians to have completed a very impressive feat to be able to go long term without having consumed much food and do fine, to come out of that and not have any long-term permanent damage from the lack of eating. He does stir up a little controversy here about how commercial reasons for journalistic purposes, they try to smother the true story. But truthfully, if we want to go there, who knows what happened? But we do know that she would have, if she refused food, and she did say she refused food, she would have been force fed through a tube. And that was practiced regularly. It was not necessarily a torturous thing to go through. It was pretty, it looked pretty mild. They feed it through the nose or they feed it down the throat. She's in a twilight state, not really concerned. And then they would pour a formula, or I guess in today's day, a protein shake down. So she's still not chewing, eating, swallowing, or consuming on her own. So for her to still stick to her story of, no, I didn't eat or drink, but they force fed me with a tube, that is very possible. It's also possible that she generally reduced the amount of food that she ate to such a point that one would call it starvation or a starvation diet. And we have seen now through research that we as humans can actually operate at a very low caloric amount, even down to 300 to 500 calories a day, and still operate just fine. So it's possible, even though that number is really shocking, it's possible she could have been doing that and just been saying, I don't eat very much or very often. And we didn't get to see that full conversation in those news articles. So here we have 4 generations of the Nashes. Martha on the left, her son Ralph, who is no longer with us, my mother, Jodi Nash Decker, and there I am holding up the diary or the journal with the original handwriting and such. At some point, these pages, which are falling apart, will be donated to museums for their preservation and for educational purposes. So that is all I have for the presentation, but I want to get to the questions that you have for us. I want to remind you that if you have any more questions later or want to join in on the conversation, learn a bit more about the book, where we do publish her entire anthology of poems, including all the tell-alls, the eyewitness accounts, the good stuff and the scary stuff, it's all in there. We have a genealogical background. We have an entire assessment of the breatharian lifestyle, the yellow journalism of the time. So it's got a little bit for everyone, for the curious and the conspiracy theorists. And we're also on Facebook at 7 Years Insane. So now I'll go ahead and turn over our time to Sarah to bring up any questions that might have popped up.
Thank you so much, Janelle. As you said, it was a wonderful story. I enjoyed reading it. And all of the poems, and it's an invaluable resource to museums like ours and the one in St. Paul, and just having that firsthand account of what these patients went through, especially because there was a whole lot of taking away that personalization to try to retain their privacy, a lot of stigma behind that. So we really appreciate your story and you coming to tell us that today. I don't see any in the chat here or on Facebook right now. And I did think we had answered Robin's question, but if anybody here on Zoom would like to, feel free to unmute yourself. Feel free to either share your video or not, and we can take questions that way also.
Excellent. Robin, do you have a question?
I don't have any questions. I just wanted to thank you for sharing your great-grandmother's story. It's really interesting. And I've been to the Glore Museum. Oh my God, it's amazing.
I can't wait to go.
Thank you for your review.
Oh.
We did have a question in the chat. Which poem is your favorite?
So the poems are, when I arranged them, I did put them in different categories. Here's all the poems about her kid. Here's all the poems about the asylum, because they're a mixed bag and some people don't want to read the scary stuff. So I kind of have a favorite from each category. There is one there's two really in the asylum specific category. One is about how even if you're not crazy, you're going to be by the time you get here, and you stay long enough, you're going to be. And that resonates with me reading another account by Jim Curran, who is, I think, a pseudonym, but Jim Curran was in the same hospital at the same time. And he wrote in his memoir about a man, when he went in for depression, and he saw this man standing in front of a music stand, and he was playing the air violin. And he thought, oh, geez, he's way off his rocker. And he asked this gentleman, he said, what are you doing? And the man, being completely lucid, maybe not mentally ill, maybe in for who knows what, he said, what else am I supposed to do when I'm in here? You know, so I do think about things like that. And I love that poem because it does say, hey, I'm not crazy, but I don't know, might as well start being it, I guess. If she's going to get shocked, if she's going to get dunked for no reason, you know, I don't know, it's tough. But there's also one where it's called Fated Chase, and she imagines herself as a runaway renegade cowboy. And she imagines racing off into the distance on her horse, and the sheriff and the posse, they're all coming after her. And ultimately, there's nowhere for her to go. There is no escape from her committal and from her crimes. She did believe spiritually maybe she was paying for some kind of crime, or maybe she was being punished for the infidelity that was happening and such. So in this Fated Chase, she just goes off on her one last wild ride until she cannot anymore. So I really think that's super cool for the Western lovers or the poetry fans who want to see something that's not necessarily in that genre. She goes off into different genres and different rhythms and styles, which I think is cool. Good question.
I think that's definitely something that a lot of people will have preconceived notions about what the Glore Psychiatric Museum is. And we do showcase a lot of our patient art and what we have of first hand accounts. And a lot of people come out like, oh, I had no idea, like they were such an artist. This is so beautiful. So I really like that you all are sharing those poems, you know, that she had written while she was in there that show all of the different sides to this. We are fortunate enough to have in Missouri, Arthur Kraft. He actually stayed here at the State Asylum #2 for a while, not for mental illness per se. He stayed in our alcoholism ward, but wrote a book about his stay here as well. So I see very similar ties into both books, which was interesting for me. So hopefully you all have learned something here with us today. And you can pick up the book if you are in St. Joseph at the Glore Psychiatric Museum gift shop. Janelle, where else can they find poems for the asylum?
The book is at the St. Peter, it's the hospital, the St. Peter Museum Hospital, or Hospital Museum, I'm saying that backwards. It's in the Nicollet County Historical Society and the St. Peter Historical Society, soon to be Ramsey County Historical Society, and worldwide on Amazon. And I'm seeing it pop up in Europe and Australia now. People are catching on. And also, there is a little bit of a following in Italy right now. And Martha is still a person of interest with the breatharian community. And so, if this has been an enjoyable experience for you and you want to hear more, that's very targeted, very focused on that type of lifestyle and what her contributions to it might have been. I will be presenting at the 2022 Chronic World Festival via Zoom, and so more information on that will be on our Facebook page at 7 Years Insane.
Perfect. I don't see any other questions on our Facebook chat. There were a couple other comments. Jodi did put out thank you. So thank you again for you all to be here. And then we had Mary Ann that said that this was amazing, that she survived with any kind of sanity. So touching again on that, if you weren't crazy going in, you may be when you come out of this. But
yeah, definitely. I'd like to offer that I know a lot of people might be coming in late or joining even at a different date, that for the next probably week, I'll be able to check in on the Facebook comments and even on the Facebook events. And if there's questions that pop up, I'm happy to answer. So if it's not the day of the live presentation, put your questions in anyways, and I'll follow up with you later.
absolutely. Thank you, Janelle, for doing that. And we will definitely monitor that over the next at least week or so. And then we'll get your questions answered either by myself or Janelle. And we will see you soon for another Psychology Social Hour.
Thank you very much, everyone.